In this video, we're going to talk about unit roles, army archetypes, and tempo. Over the years, I have covered a lot of Warhammer events. I get asked a lot how to analyze armies, how to analyze army lists, and how they're going to play and who's going to win. When I go to events like the Age of Sigmar World Championship and we do the live coverage and we stream those games, only they know.
Yeah, they're War Scroll spell, and they have one of the best ones in the game when you take them in concert with all the troops that it's got. It's like a scene from Thriller, isn't it?
It's just...
We're gonna both that. No, we're out of sync. Do it again. We got to do it again. Going that way first. No, you got to do that, and then we do that way.
I have to work out how best to describe what I'm seeing happen on the tabletop to people around the world, and that's just not a resource that existed. Wasn't available. I just had to make it up. I started doing it initially for Games Workshop, and that was stressful. A big multinational company had me describe a game which they had no words to describe what they saw happening on the tabletop. So I just made them up, wrote them down, and then me and everyone else who does live coverage with me uses those words. I also think they're a really great way of analyzing how the game plays. And I didn't just start from scratch. There are already loads of great resources for analyzing competitive play. Maybe not Warhammer, but definitely things like chess, League of Legends, StarCraft have all got raging esports communities. I don't think raging was the right word. I should have used a different word. But how to analyze those and the professionalism of the analytics that they apply when people play the games are so cool. I've always been mega impressed by them, and I really wish that there was some sort of resources available to me when I started out doing this. But there weren't, and I made them up. And maybe they're not great, or maybe they're brilliant. I don't know. But these are the ones that I use, and I hope you can learn something from them too. I started reading a load of blogs and watching loads of videos. The one I found most helpful was a PDF called Playing to Win, and I've included it in the show notes, and I'll attach it to the blog on the website this video will be a part of. And that's because when you get to the Age of Sigmar World Championships, or even if you get to any competitive event, there are players there who are playing at the very top of their game. At AOS Worlds, for example, you have 2 teams of 8. And while everyone in Australia may call the type of archetypes we're going to talk about something different to the people who are representing, let's say, Team Germany, those archetypes are very real. And you can see them play out time and again, no matter which country or which scene is playing those particular armies. I've been lucky enough to travel around the world and see all of these different communities playing Warhammer. And so I can see the similarities and the threads between them all. So let's get into it. I thought I'd share with you what I've learned, and hopefully we could all build something together, which is what I'm always really interested in. There are 2 major categories to go through: army archetypes and unit roles. And later on in the video, we're going to talk about tempo. Army lists normally have an overall theme or a strategy. We call this the list archetype. So at a simple glance, you can work out how the list will try to work. This doesn't mean it always works that way, but it's mainly its win condition. Here's a quick run through of all the terms. Alpha Strike tries to win on the first turn. Counter Strike, or a trading army, tries to effectively counter an Alpha Strike. Pinning, Swamp, or Alpha Blocking list tries to win by pinning their opponent into their deployment zone. A Castle Build tries to screen the valuable units. A Damage Check archetype tries to make it so that you can't kill everything in the army. A Control archetype tries to reduce the enemy efficiency. And a Meme Skew list is really just for shit posters. Unit roles. These are the primary roles that the unit takes up in the army or a game. But of course they can pivot, and your best damage dealer can become your best screening unit if it's going to get you the points that you need to win the game. A unit normally tells you with its rules on its war scroll what it wants you to do with it in the game. As an example, a Fate Master from the Disciples of Tzeentch gives a +1 to wound aura to units around it. Sure, he does have a big spear, and he could run across the board and try to fight the enemy units all on his own. However, that isn't going to be anywhere near as effective as using him as a support piece for a unit of, say, loads of Zangor. Using him to give +1 to wound to a huge amount of attacks is far more effective than using him to Leroy Jenkins him across the board. So units normally tell you what their roles should be in an army thanks to the rules that they have on their war scroll. Here's a quick run through of all of the unit role terms. A support unit increases the efficiency of friendly units. A damage dealer does, shockingly, damage. A unit that's going to be an Anvil resists lots of damage. A screen blocks important areas or units from damage. And a points grabber just gets the gold, baby. Just makes the money. So units have primary roles, and that's why we include them in our lists. And then the army plays a certain way, and that's what we call the list archetype. The final piece of this puzzle is tempo, and we're going to cover that at the end of this video. Let's break down unit roles in more detail, and I'll be using the classic film The Lord of the Rings to help make this make more sense for all of us. The support role, or Samwise Gamgee. Very much like Samwise Gamgee, a support's job is to make a unit more survivable, make it more defensible, get it across the board easier, or get that ring to Mordor because Frodo is a bloody Wizards are always a support unit, as they can cast Mystic Shield, which, combined with all-out defense, means you can give a unit +2 to its save. Seeing as units are assigned points value based on their survivability, as well as other things, obviously, being able to skew the math by giving it +2 to the save is really, really good. Of course, Wizards can also cast game-changing spells. They can be located on their war scroll or from the spell lore for the army. I know what you're thinking. We should review every single spell lore and do a spell lore tier video. Let's go. Other support units give direct buffs, like a War Chanter giving a unit +1 damage, or a Chaos Sorcerer Lord giving a unit a 6+ ward save. A Chaos Sorcerer Ward. Some support units are priests, and very much like a wizard, they will also increase the efficacy of some units. So a support unit's primary role is to make a unit do more damage, make it more survivable, or some sort of utility, like a teleport or a better chance at a rally. Obviously, all of these support pieces cost points, and having too many support pieces can be a problem because you don't have enough things to buff. When you do stack a huge amount of buffs on a singular unit, we call this a Death Star. Now, Death Stars are either really good or they're not as good, but it's a very specific type of build. We should also talk about economies of scale and redundancy. Redundancy is the easy one. It's what corporations do to pay larger dividends to their shareholders instead of actually, creating a better business or making its workforce healthier and happier. But also, in wargaming terms, it means taking multiples of a unit so that if one of your support pieces dies, you have a redundant one that can be used instead. Economies of scale is where your support action has increased efficiency. An example is Bloodstalkers and Morathi. Bloodstalkers come in units of 5, and Morathi has a command ability that allows them to shoot in the hero phase. It costs 1 command point. However, it costs the same amount, 1 command point, if you have 5 or 15. So you're getting more use out of that command ability if you have a larger unit to do it on. And that's economies of scale. Really easy. Support in that way is normally the largest economy of scale that you can get in your army, which creates a problem for your opponent. Example support units are a Lord Relictor from Stormcast Eternals because he can teleport a unit, the War Chanter from Auric Warclans because they give +1 damage to a unit, and the Necromancer from Soulblight Gravelords because you can make a unit pile in and attack twice. Damage dealers, sometimes known as hammers, a damage dealer is the Gimli of our unit rolls. It's self-explanatory really. The damage dealers do damage. However, if we try to break down the role of having a damage dealer in an army a little bit more, we can start to talk about things like bully units or threat projection. Let's talk about a unit of 4 Fulminators. They move 10 inches and obviously they can charge 2d6. This means they threaten the enemy at 22 inches, which is a sum of their movement plus their potential charge. Let's say for Slaves to Darkness, I have a unit of Therodons. They're a pretty good hammer unit, but they are fragile. A glass cannon, which is a subcategory of damage dealer, which just means a fragile damage dealing unit. However, they only have a move range of 6 inches. They do have +1 to charge, but this does mean that their potential threat range is lower than the Fulminators. This means the Slaves to Darkness player can't aggressively block the board. What I mean by this is they can't threaten to hit a certain part of the board without themselves being under threat of being hit first. Basically, movement with damage dealers is like a game of chicken and also cowboy quick draws all rolled into one. You want to hit their damage dealers first. And if you're faster than them, they're going to have to use screens and trading units to be able to get the jump on your damage dealing units. What if you don't take any damage dealers and you just take really tough, survivable units? There's a couple of list archetypes that will work for that, mainly damage check and control armies. If you take too many damage dealers, then you fall prey to potentially being hit by control lists. But if you don't take enough damage dealers, then you'll get hit by damage check archetypes. I don't think there's really an answer to how many damage dealers to have in your army, but I think 2 to 3 major threats in an army list always looks good on the tabletop. Damage dealers are always really between 2 subclasses, glass cannons and brawlers. I was going to do like a brawler thing. I don't know what. Put them up, ladder. No, not for me. Put your jukes up, lads. No. Glass cannons, as the name suggests, are damage dealers that do a lot of damage but are very fragile and will be removed quickly. Brawlers are different in that they can take a lot of damage and keep fighting. However, every one of these units is on some sort of sliding scale. So let's look at that. The chart for units looks a bit more like this. Output versus survivability. However, the delivery method for that damage is what I talked about in the first masterclass video, and that's all to do with effective range. Delivering the damage is often even more important than the damage itself. So another chart looks like this: output times effective range. Adding this all together, we have this new chart for assessing damage dealing units. I always think of these 3 stats in this order. Effective range, because you have to get there to do the damage. Survivability, because you have to survive to get there to do the damage. And lastly, damage output, which I know seems strange. You would think the first thing you prioritize in a unit is its ability to do damage, but that's last of my 3 priorities. Let's look what happens when we prioritize, which we do all the time, raw damage. 6 Bolt Boys versus 3 Enlightened in the Tzeentch army. 6 Bolt Boys have a much higher damage value. However, they don't have the effective threat range or the survivability of the Enlightened on disc. So while they do more damage, they just aren't as good. Examples of damage dealers or good damage dealers are Chaos Chosen, because they have a great profile anyway, and they have the ability to pile in and attack twice, once per battle. Another great unit is Fulminators, because of the frankly ludicrous amount of damage that they do when they charge. Anvils. At the opposite end of the spectrum, you have Anvils, or damage takers. They are very much like Boromir. You have to take the damage so as to protect the valuable assets that are the hobbits. Or maybe they're like Faramir, taking the emotional damage from his dad. Or maybe they're like the helmet in that scene where Viggo Mortensen kicks it. Did you know that These are units that are survivable thanks to good defensive stats. Either a high armor save or a ward save like Phoenix Guard, or multiple debuffs like minuses to hit that you find on things like Plague Bearers. There is also a unit that's a type of Anvil based on just how many wounds are inside of the unit, and your opponent just does not have the damage potential to clear all of those wounds. Pink Horrors have always been a really good example of this. They're a 50 wound unit for 255 points. However, with the increase in things like Rally being very common in Age of Sigmar now, where you can return slain models and units, that level of healing and returning models might make these wound sink units even better than Pink Horrors traditionally were. So again, we have 2 subclasses in this unit role. We have armor tanking and we have wound tanking. Pretty self-explanatory. The armor tanking just has good armor saves, ward saves, and can take a lot of damage via that process. And wound tanking is just having a lot of wounds that rally on a 4+. Examples of good anvils are Chaos Warriors, who have a good armor save, a ward save against mortal wounds, and they can even rally on 5+. Moonclan Grots can have units that are -1 to hit in very huge numbers and can rally each hero phase on a 4+. Nighthaunt are also another great example because they have an unrenderable save, access to ward saves, and the ability to return models to the units. A screen is usually a very cheap unit. For this example from The Lord of the Rings, we're going to take that kid from Helm's Deep. Imagine a screen is like him, but just like loads of him. All of his classmates, all with little swords. Often they're just battle line units that stand in front of your army to stop the opponent's big damage dealers from hitting all of your valuable units. The unit's role changes depending on what you're facing. If your opponent is going to run at you and try and hit your army, then your unit that was a screen can turn into something that's going to zone out the board from things like deep strikes. Screening units can also be used to trade. So simply you pop them onto an objective, your opponent charges them and kills them, and then you charge that unit and kill them. Trading is really valuable because in a lot of instances, your opponent always has to do something about a unit that's holding an objective. This means you can control the flow of the battle by trading a smaller, weaker unit and getting their bigger unit in return. I guess trading units are a lot like bait, like Nate Trentinelli. Tasty tasty bait. Last point on this is that in Age of Sigmar, you can't get within 3 inches of an enemy unit unless you charge it. So you've got the ability to zone and have more board control than you would in something like 40k. You can also have very aggressive screens. These become the backbone of pinning and zoning armies. You swamp your opponent into their deployment zone and you make it so that they just can't get out. While people often take screaming units, they can obviously be used for things like damage and also holding objectives. So they're generally just cheap units that you can find in your army. Therefore, my examples are just any poor lads you can find. Points grabber. As a primary role, a points grabber's job is to, unsurprisingly, score points. All you're trying to do is get the ring to Mordor. That's it. Just get the points, which is what will eventually make you win the game. People who love points grabber units are the same sort of people who say things like, why didn't they just take the eagles to Mordor? And while they're technically correct, quicker, more effective, ultimately, we hate you. Some units score battle tactics and generate points so well that that's the whole reason they're taken in a list. Of course, everyone can hold objectives, but some units, like brutes from the Ironjaw's army, make it so that 1 wound models won't count for holding the objective. Therefore, they have an advantage, and it's something to consider when putting them in your list. Other examples are units that can deep strike, and they can score points from battle tactics without ever having to engage with the enemy. Some other units do specific army actions, which also will gain them points for doing something without ever engaging with the opponent. These units are a little bit on the rarer side, and they're confusing because when you're facing off against the enemy army, you're already looking at the damage dealers and wondering how you're going to deal with them. And then there are these other units which are going to score the points. And that can really mess with your target priority because you should be focusing on things that score points. Just be conscious of these units because beating units up is cool. Having that big fight outside of Mordor is great, but really the way to win is just sneak up a mountain and drop a ring in a fire. Example units are Untamed Beasts because they get a pre-game move, Tree Revenants because they have the ability to teleport every turn, and Canary, who have a deep strike baked into their war scroll, which they can then also use to move. So that's all the unit roles. Let me know what you think about these examples. I'd love to hear all your comments, so just drop them below. Let's go look at archetypes. Archetypes are easier, I think. It's how the army wants to play. I thought about adding example lists, but with a big points update, it could all just go away. If you could think about what armies you play and write down what archetype they are and leave them in the comments, that might help a load of other people get some ideas. And I like to read every single comment, so it might genuinely give me some ideas. So I'd really appreciate it. So the Alpha Strike. The key points are that they have units with a high amount of potential damage, large effective range across lots of the army, so either very fast or long-range weapons. They hit the enemy army on the first turn, destroying the ability of the army to retaliate. Their strengths, that they're effective into fragile armies. They have dominant early game and have the potential to force mistakes from the opponent. Their weaknesses are that they leave armies overextended and weak to counter-strikes, and you simply might not have enough damage to do a successful Alpha Strike. Examples of these are Ironjaws with lots of Gore Grunters, Gloomspite Gits with a big block of Hoppers, and also Puskul Blightlords with the pre-game move Flies, but you don't generally tend to see that as much anymore. Next army archetype are Counter-Strike trading armies. The key points are they have some sort of ranged attack or threat, making the opponent need to close the gap between your army and their army, have high damage units to counter-attack with, have cheap screening or trading units. Their strengths are that they're relatively safe early game, waiting for the opponent to engage with you. They normally score well, and they're trying to force the opponent to overcommit. Weaknesses are that they might not punch back hard enough and lose efficiency before it can do, and it requires a lot of skill expression. Example armies are Nighthaunt, who can tank a lot of damage, and they have retreat and charge, so you just can't pin a ghost down. Slaves of Darkness, who can take a lot of damage and hit back very hard, and Ogres. Ogres are kind of the perfect counterpunch army, especially with the new Iron Blasters. The long-range threat from the Iron Blasters forces you to have to go towards them to try to deal with them because it's a lot of output. However, there's a big snarling Stonehorn about to hit you, and that is the perfect counterpunch, counter-strike army. Next, we have pinning, alpha blocking, and swamping armies. The key points are that they're very mobile. They normally have defensive elements, trapping you back, and they score well early. Their strengths are that they're really good against slow armies. They put pressure on by early game scoring, and sometimes your opponent just doesn't have an answer. Weaknesses are that they can be countered and the list might not work another way, and they lose tempo late game as units are counterattacked. Examples are a Slaves to Darkness army with a large block of Chaos Knights pinning your opponent back early game. Nighthaunt with Hex Wraiths, running up the board and pinning you back into your deployment. And Host Duplicitous armies for Tzeentch, which means you can't retreat, with big blocks of pink horrors, which are very difficult units to get away from. Next up, we have a castle archetype. Key points about this army are they have a strong defensive build. They're trying to protect high-value units. They have series of overlapping buffs and synergies. Their strengths are that they want you to engage on its terms. Good into mixed armies that can't crack a castle, so an army that doesn't necessarily have the output in one go to punch through a castle wall. The weaknesses are that it can get pinned into its own deployment, and if it doesn't have the ability to punch out of it, then it's trapped there. Struggles early game to hold the primary objectives as it's trying to stay in its defensive formation. Example armies are, of course, the Lumineth Castle, the Daughters of Cain Shooting Castle, and something like Tzeentch with their spellcasting castle, which is going to ramp up thanks to all of their summoning. The next archetype is the Damage Check army. Key points are it's built to be unkillable and hold objectives. The strengths are they're very good at holding objectives, normally can play all 5 turns well, so they have more options for scoring. The weaknesses are if someone can pass through the damage check, they lose. They rely on characters and buffs or debuffing your enemy, so you can maybe stop that. Examples are 180 Gloomspite Gits with triple 4+ rally every hero phase, lots of pink horrors in a Tzeentch army being -1 to hit and also just having a lot of wounds, or unrendable Blood Knight builds from Soulblight Gravelords. The Control archetype. Key points are they reduce enemy efficiency with debuffs. They manage the board and the enemy army to stop it doing what it wants to do. Strengths massively reduce enemy efficiency and synergy. Very tough to play against as a new player. And their weaknesses are they require a large amount of system mastery. They're fragile and they require high skill expression. An example is Archeon and Be'lakor. Be'lakor has the ability to shut down an enemy army's key piece, where Archeon is going to know what one of the priority roles is going to be. They have much more control of the game than most other armies, being able to close down an enemy unit and also know how the turn order is going to go. Control armies are often on the rarer side, but when they are used well, they are devastating. Okay, next army archetype is meme and skew lists. A skew army is an army or list that over-specializes in a certain area. However, an Ironjaw's army with mainly all gore grunters isn't a skew list. Confusing, right? It's a term that really denotes when someone has pushed a theme too far. And its weaknesses are very pronounced, but its strength is in the fact that it's a skew. However, oddly, there are skew lists that are not always a meme. Good example would be loads of pink horrors or lots of Ungor raiders. What you're effectively doing is creating too much of a problem with one thing. However, sometimes you have a meme list, like 11 steam tanks or loads of cockatrices, which isn't a skew list. I think the difference between the two ideas on this list archetype is that one man's rubbish is another man's gold. It seems to be the effectiveness of the list that makes serious people be like, yes, this is a good skew list, good for teams. And meme lists are just dismissed as being dumb and silly until they win something, and then all of a sudden, I'm not sure if it's an archetype, but it's definitely a list concept that we see a lot. And most of those list concepts normally will fit in the categories that we've discussed before. If you have any other examples of army archetypes or things you think I may have missed, I'd love to read about them in the comments below, so drop them down there. Before we wrap up, I would like to talk about one more thing, which I'm not 100% on, and it's called Army Tempo. Also, I have a Patreon. I'd love you to sign up and support me so I can create more incredibly niche, specific content on this subject. And I want to thank everyone who is already a Patreon for supporting me and making it so I can make stuff like this. Okay, so some armies play fast and some armies play slow, but I'm not talking about the movement value on those units, talking about the flow of the game. Tempo is defined as the rate or speed of motion or activity. Normally, at the start of a game, someone has an advantage thanks to the unit compositions of the two armies. This creates both armies' tempo. A battle plan or a mission can also have a tempo. For instance, if all the objectives start turned off and then slowly turn on as the game progresses, then the tempo of the battle plan slows down because there's an initial rush to grab the singular objective at the start. However, if there is a mission where objectives disappear, then the tempo of the game speeds up, as you don't need to engage or deploy as many resources in engagements early in the game. This frames tempo as the speed at which you need to commit your resources to the fight times the amount of resources you need to commit. High tempo armies engage early with lots of resources. These are Alpha Strike and pinning lists, versus low tempo armies, which engage with limited resources, setting up for later engagements. These are castle and control builds. When this all falls down is when all three factors combine in a game. The tempo of your army, the tempo of their army, and the tempo of the mission or battle plan. The only effective way to analyze this is to go through every army versus every other army on every battle plan. And I'm just not going to do that. Maybe eventually that's something we'll do in a blog post via some sort of Excel sheet, which would be fun to do. However, this idea is something that's very real. I've witnessed it on the tabletop myself, especially when I'm covering live games. Also, if you speak to players, or you yourself might tell a story of when you were too aggressive at the start or not aggressive enough at the start. Too aggressive is just too high tempo, and not aggressive enough is your tempo was too low. Some armies get to maintain a level amount of tempo thanks to things like summoning and rallies. Some armies don't have those rules though, and therefore their tempo fluctuates a lot based on losses and casualties. It's one of those things I was a little bit uncertain to talk about in the video because it's intuitive in a lot of ways. I think sometimes this is the thing that makes the difference between a good player and a great player. Sure, you can know what the opposing army does, but it's how it wants to play and at what pace it wants to play is really important to know. Knowing that means that you can plan accordingly and around it. I hope you enjoyed the video. I really hope you enjoyed the video. This is one of those things that's actually really, really interesting to me, but I think sometimes could be maybe a bit dry because ultimately it's just words. But I think understanding how game plays and getting into the minutiae is so incredibly interesting when you actually analyze it. And the players that play it at a very high level do play with most of these ideas in mind. So I'd love to know what you think. And I'd also love you to share it with people and let other people know about this stuff. So hopefully it becomes a more competent and easy way of understanding how to play these games. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for being honest, Wargamers.